Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another of this centenary series of London lectures brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Thank you all very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Naomi Eilan from the University of Warwick, where she's also director of the Warwick Mind and Action Research Centre. Naomi is an instinctive collaborator, both with other philosophers and with psychologists. She's edited a series of volumes over the years, each of which seems to have launched a research area and brought onto the philosophical map an area of inquiry that didn't really exist before. I'm thinking particularly of her works on bodily awareness and on joint attention, which people just weren't thinking about before she did these research projects about them. And now she is currently co-directing a Leverhulme British Academy project on the second person. And judging from the title of her talk this evening, usually people have very long titles. I try to announce them, I can't remember them. This is nice and short. It's The U-Turn. She's going to be sharing some ideas from that project. That's my guess anyway. Naomi, over to you.
Thanks, Okay, well, it's a great honour and pleasure to take part in the centenary celebrations of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and thank you to Edward for inviting me to give one of the lectures. The brief for participants in these centenary lectures was, and I'm quoting, to reflect on where their area of the discipline has got to over the last 100 years, and or where it might go or should go over the next 100. The focus of my lecture is the special role played by the second person in our knowledge of other people. If I'd been asked a decade or so ago, I'd say that philosophy had gone wrong over the last 100 years in missing out or not properly exploiting Buber's and others' insights into the second person. Happily, that's beginning to change in ways I'll begin to describe. As will emerge, focus on the second person raises a slew of new further issues and new connections amongst old issues, and some of which I hope will be pursued for at least another 100 years. So that's the brief. To set the scene for the topic I'll be talking about, the nature of second-person awareness and second-person relations, it will help to have before us a brief formulation of the traditional problem of our minds. So the problem goes like this. Each of us has immediate, non-observational, non-inferential knowledge of our conscious mental states, of our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations. Moreover, as Descartes noted, when our knowledge is based on this kind of awareness, it seems to come with an eye glued onto it, so to speak. It doesn't make sense to be aware of a pain in this way and to wonder someone's in pain, but is it I who's feeling it? What about our knowledge of other people in this traditional formulation? As the problem of other minds is traditionally presented, the contrast couldn't be starker. Such knowledge, the claim is based on observation of bodies, and our knowledge of what others are thinking and feeling is based on inference from the perceived movement of the bodies to the minds hidden behind them. This is the famous first-person, third-person divide. The nature of this inference is such that the existence of other minds, like one's own, is, when all is said and done, merely probable. But that's the best we can hope for, given the input. For all that such accounts deliver, it's possible, and here I'm quoting the 18th century philosopher Thomas Reid, it's possible that what I call a father, a brother, or a friend is only a parcel of ideas in my own mind. I'm left alone as the only creature of God in the universe in that forlorn state of egoism. Or as Cavell put it, I think you've got it on top of your handouts, he says, what's the worst that befalls me should it be the case that material objects don't exist? I suffer a generalized trompe-l'oeil and, of course, trompe-l'oeil. But if there are no human beings, then what befalls me is a generalized and massive trompe-l'âme. My soul cheats me into taking it that it has company. If our knowledge of others is merely probable, our souls may be thus cheated for all that we know. Now, questions about our knowledge that other people exist and of what's going on in their minds have received relatively little attention compared with the tomes written since Descartes aimed at justifying our claims to know that physical objects exist. When philosophers have turned their attention to the question about other people, in fits and starts, and mainly over the past 100 years or so, the answers have tended to be peculiarly inadequate, as the quote from Reid and indeed Cavell make vivid. And what is interesting is how little this has bothered people, with some exceptions. If challenged, I expect the following two justifications would be proffered. First, with respect to the relative neglect of the question of other minds, the claim might be that the resources we should appeal to when explaining our knowledge of other minds and of their existence are exactly the same as those that we appeal to when we explain our knowledge of the material world. Given this, accounting for our knowledge of other minds is of not much epistemological additional interest. It merely requires adding some bells and whistles, some new kinds of inferences, but it's the same kind of thing. So that's what I've called the nothing special challenge, claim rather. As to the lack of concern, this is what I'm calling the isolation claim. Our knowledge of other minds is, on this view, what I think would be proffered as a justification for the lack of concern, is an isolable add-on to other kinds of fundamental capacities and kinds of knowledge. And the account we give of other minds has no bearing on them. No bearing, for example, on the account we give of self-consciousness, the sense in which we are essentially social beings, knowledge of others through the world through testimony, the objectivity of perceptions, or our ethical engagement with others. So we can go on tackling all this vast array of topics of philosophical interest without engaging with the problem of our knowledge of other minds. Okay, turning now to the title of my talk, which was proposed to me in jest by someone in this audience, actually, but stuck, for better or for worse. I borrow it from the introduction to a 2014 edited collection of papers on the second person in philosophical explorations that was published a year later as a book on the second person. In the same year, 2014, another collection of papers called The Second Person, edited by Jim Conant and Sebastian Rödel, appeared in Philosophical Topics. At the time, I referred to what I call, I quote, a surge of work conducted under the second person heading in various areas of philosophy of mind, of language, ethics, epistemology, and in developmental psychology and neuroscience. A decade later, that body of work has only grown, with a welcome addition of a dialogue between philosophers working in the continental and analytic tradition. To put it at its most general, a slogan uniting much, not all, but much of this work, is that proper attention to the way we gain knowledge of each other when we are aware of each other as you bridges the first person, third person divide that informs the traditional formulation of the problem of other minds. And also, by providing, an alternative to the claim that our knowledge of others is based on observation and inference. So the nothing special claim is false. Moreover, to put it now at its most ambitious, an explanation of how this works has repercussion for central aspects of our mental, ethical, and social lives. So the isolation claim is false. Now, to quote Doug Lavin in a paper, Other Wills, in the 2014 special issue, I quote, "Like Martin Buber, who likens Feuerbach's laying hold of the thou to a Copernican revolution in human self-understanding, I can get carried away by such talk, but what does it mean? And one might add, what exactly does it refer to? For there are many varieties of such talk across many domains and many distinct and various accounts of why taking the second person seriously leads to insights so far lacking." In what follows, I'm not going to attempt to summarize them or take them all into account, but I will be drawing on insights they provide. Instead, I'm going to focus on setting out what I think is the best account of the second person for the purposes of bridging the first person, third person divide, and for showing the repercussions that putting the second person center stage has for the way we engage with other issues in philosophy. In developing this account, I'll be drawing on things that Martin Buber said 100 years ago, apropos the centenary title of this series of lectures. Now, this may seem a surprising resource for questions about our knowledge of other minds, as approached from an analytic perspective like my own. Buber's style is laden with often gnomic aphorisms and metaphors, and he's primarily concerned with theological and ethical questions. Nevertheless, I believe that we can extract from his writings the clearest and most compelling account available of second-person awareness, and the account best suited for bringing into view connections between our knowledge of others and other aspects of our mental and ethical lives. Okay, last preliminary. The plan for the talk is as follows. In the first part, I'll sketch an account of the nature of second-person relations, drawing on Buber. In the second part, I'll illustrate the significance of this way of viewing our knowledge of other minds for 3 areas of research that I hope will be followed up on and developed in years to come. The first is, the suggestion is that putting the second person center stage will provide a framework for showing that our knowledge of people can't be just a matter of knowledge of facts, observation, and inference, but also has an essential relational, emotional ingredient. The nothing special claim is in this respect false. And second, by way of showing that the isolation claim is false, I'm going to talk about 2 roles, I hope I'll get to both of them. 2 areas of research which are affected and transformed, I think, by putting the second person center stage. The first is the link between knowledge of people and basic question in ethics. The second is the role played by the kind of sociality manifested by our second person awareness of others in grounding objective thought. Second-person relations and awareness of others are, as it were, the hinge that connects aspects of our mental and moral life that tend to be treated in complete isolation from each other. Now, I should say, by way of warning, I always underestimate how long a talk of mine is going to take. All these years doing it, I still haven't got it right. So it may be that the third topic, the link with objectivity, is one that I won't get to, however much I try to stick to my word per minute. if that happens, I'd be delighted to talk about issues that are I've summarized on the handout. I'd be delighted to answer questions about it in the discussion time. Okay, so to set the scene and to keep something, as it were, down to earth in mind before we get too abstract, consider the following scenario. You're sitting at a pep talk organized by senior university administrators, in which the idea of your university's entrepreneurial gene, say, or some other piece of nonsense, is being promoted. Now contrast the following two cases. The first case. You look across at a colleague, wondering how she is taking it. You see her head in her hands or the drumming of her fingers and conclude she's hating it. Or more disconcertingly, you see her eyes shining with enthusiastic endorsement and concludes that she loves it, or better, pretending to love it. That's the first kind of case. Here's the second kind of case, and there's two versions of it. Version 1. At some point, you raise your head from your doodling, and your eyes meet those of a colleague sitting opposite you. You may or may not, because of some distraction, go on to exchange views by making various faces. As in the first case, you may agree or disagree. She conveys enthusiasm, you convey dismay, and so forth. That's the first version of the second kind of case. The second version of the second kind of case is you wait until the end of the proceedings before going over and beginning a conversation with her about the meeting. Here too, it may turn out that you agree or disagree. Now, the basic idea behind the claims about the second person I'm about to spell out are these. First, there's a fundamental difference between the way we gain knowledge of others through observation, as in the first case, and the way we do so through conversation. Second, the nonverbal exchange of looks and facial expressions and the verbal exchange have this in common. They are both conversations, an activity that essentially takes two, framed by adoptions of attitudes of mutual address, and hence second-person awareness. So that's the claim about the second kinds of case. So just one last clarification before spelling out what that claim amounts to in more detail. It might help to have the following distinction before us when asking about our knowledge of other minds. One question we might ask is, what's the most basic way we have of acquiring knowledge of what people are thinking, what they're feeling? The second is a question about how we know that there are counterparts to my I, this I that's glued to my experiences. Other centers of consciousness, other first-person perspectives. I have on the hand, that's the solipsis challenge, right? I have on the handout, I think, Merleau-Ponty's version of the question. He wrote in 1945. How can the word I be put into the plural? How can a general idea of the I be formed? How can an I speak of an I other than my own? How can I know that there are other I's? How can consciousness, which by its nature and as self-knowledge is in the mode of the I, be grasped in the mode of the thou? So what I'll be spelling out initially under what I'm calling the second-person communication claim is an answer to that question. I'll come back soon to a few comments about the role of the second person in explaining knowledge of what other people are thinking. So the second-person communication says, communication claims says, that our grip on the idea that other self-conscious subjects exist is rooted in our capacity to enter into particular kinds of communicative relations or exchanges with others, in which we adopt attitudes of mutual address and think of each other as you. And this claim rests on three ideas of Buber's, which I've given titles to in your handout. This is all extracted from I and thou. So the first I've called the communicative relation claim, and there's a quote you have on your handout from Buber. I'm quoting, "I experience the it. I bring back from the encounter with things some knowledge of their condition. I experience what there is to things. But my relation to the you is different from this. The basic word I-you establishes the world of relation. Whoever says you does not have something as his object. He stands in a relation." That's the first claim. The second claim is the mutual interdependence claim. Relation is reciprocity. My you acts on me as I act on it. And the final claim is the I-you claim. When one says you, the I of the you is said too. As I said, a bit gnomic, but it's not hard to interpret, in my view. So to take these in turn, beginning with the communicative relation claim. So suppose I see someone looking irritated, as in our first case, and think a third person thought to myself, such as, she looks irritated. In so doing, I stand in an experiential relation to what Buber calls the world observed. Alternatively, I might look across at her in order, as in our second case, to catch her eye, to connect. And perhaps once connected, either to indicate by raised eyebrow or gesture that I want to know how she's feeling. In so doing, in looking across at her like this, I seek to establish a communicative or dialogical relation with her. When that is the aim of my looking, I'm attempting to stand in a relation of mutual address with my colleague, and thereby to enjoy an awareness of her, to be aware of her as you. In so doing, I make my willingness to communicate, an openness to further exchange, manifest. I make manifest that channels of communication are open. I aim, that is, to establish the world of relation. I've spoken so far only of aims and attempts. The mutual interdependence claim concerns the success conditions for you awareness. Such awareness is, as Buber puts it, reciprocal or mutual. To return to our examples, I may look across at my colleague in order to catch her eye, but fail to do so, say because she's looking elsewhere, or she's looking at me but her mind's elsewhere. I'm only aware of her as you, on this account, when she reciprocates. You thinking is a kind of thinking or awareness of a person you can only have or engage in when that person, A, exists, and B, thinks about you in the same way, also as you. This is the property I'm calling mutual interdependence. Turning finally to the I-you claim, I think there's a passage for Emile Benvenisti which captures it well. Again, I think you have it on your handout. Here's the quote. "I only use I when I'm speaking to someone who will be a you in my address. It is this condition of dialogue that's constitutive of person, for it implies that reciprocally I become a you to the address of the one who in turn designates himself as an I. Neither of the terms can be conceived of without the other. They're complementary. There's a great deal going on in that passage, but for the moment, moving from language and the use of the first-person pronoun to thought, here are some of the ideas there. First, I thinking in the context of conversation is essentially relational. I in relation to you. Second, a condition on thinking such a thought is that one grasps its bidirectionality. That I am at the same time, I have to grasp a you to your I. So in thinking such thoughts, I necessarily take the other to be an I thinker. Thinking of someone as you involves thinking of her as both addresser and as addressee, where to do so is to treat her as a thinker of I thoughts. Now, that's the three claims. All three claims can do with much elaboration and would require much defense. But at this stage, I want to make do with the following two comments. First, when someone in the course of conversation with me says, I'm sad, the immediate knowledge I acquire has the content, you are sad. Given that to be aware of someone as you, to be aware of someone as you is to take her to be an I thinker, then on the face of it, the knowledge I acquire and express is at the same time knowledge that other subjects like myself exist. Okay. This is in contrast to knowledge I may express on the basis of perceptual encounter, where what I get is this person is sad. So the I is built into, the other I is built into the IU exchange. Second, and just a brief comment on knowing what people are thinking and feeling and so forth. When I ask someone how she's feeling and she tells me she's sad, the knowledge is shared. It's knowledge we both have. Again, contrast this with looking at someone and arriving at the conclusion that she's sad. You do that on your own. You're not sharing the knowledge. Okay? So that's the contrast. Now, again, lots more to say about that, but I want to move on to another comment about the three Buber claims. So, standing in a relation of mutual address involves treating the other as an I and makes my I in that context dependent on the other's existence and taking me to be an I. So far, this relationality and dependence has been restricted to the context of conversation. In this context, I'm depending on someone else to treat me as an I. But we can, and I think should, strengthen the dependence to get the full force of the kind of work that Buber's claims can make. With the following claim: the possession of a first-person perspective, capacity for I thinking, depends on having acquired the capacity to engage in these kinds of conversations. So the possession in all cases of your having a first-person perspective depends on having acquired this capacity, which of course allows for solo thinking as we do all the time, but you have to have this IU communicative capacity as a background. Now, this is a very radical claim, and it might be worth emphasizing that. Because on that account, on this kind of account, the I that's glued to my experiences that we began with, the one that's glued to my immediate knowledge of my own mental states, depends on the existence of other people and their treatment of me as an I. And many philosophers who reject various aspects of Descartes' metaphysics and epistemology would balk at this. They'd say he was right. The I that's glued onto my experiences is there independently of the world, and certainly independently of anyone treating me as an I. It's secure without any of that. So the proposal I want to have before us says that nothing short of this version of Buber's claim will bridge, in the way we think we can bridge, the first person, third person divide. So that's one radical claim. So I'll make another just brief comment before moving into connections with other areas of research, which is about the notion of communication I've been appealing to. On the kind of story that I've been sketching on Buber's behalf, we stand in a communicative relation when we adopt attitudes of mutual address towards each other. And that's a very strong requirement in what it is to stand in a communicative relation. So, for example, on one notion of communication, you stand to A and B stand in a communicative relation if A produces a message and B picks it up. No requirement of mutual address there. A slightly more demanding one is, and thought by many to be the mark of human, distinctively human communication, and this notion is owed to Grice in his 1957 paper. You stand in a communicative relation when the speaker manages to instill beliefs in you, given that's his intention, and then there's a lot of debate about how exactly that intention should be formulated, how many iterations and so forth. But that's the model for communication. And again, there's no requirement of standing in a mutual relation, in a relation of mutual address. Communication has occurred when the speaker has succeeded in instilling these beliefs in you. I think the notion of communication we need, if explaining and justifying the appeal to mutual address, to hark back to an etymologically older notion of communication, where to communicate is to commune, to connect. And I think we just have to have here a notion, introduce a notion of communication as connection to explain I-U exchanges. And I borrowed the notion of connection from the psychologist Edward Tronick, who used it to describe the underlying motivations behind what psychologists call proto-conversations between infants and adults, their carers. So they've been described in minute detail, but these conversations are described always as being initiated by smiles of address from each side. And as the baby grows older, these mature into more sophisticated forms of address and more sophisticated forms of what Tronick calls connecting. And the suggestion is that this roughly is the notion of communication that we need to have in place to justify and ground the requirement, Buber's requirement, I-U requirement, that we adopt attitudes of mutual address when we communicate. This applies to communion, and I think this is a notion of communication that we should apply when you're chatting at the bus stop about anything to somebody else. It's a notion of communication that we carry through us all the time. When there's conversation, when there's a dialogue, this is the notion of communication we should be appealing to. And of course, lots can happen in it, but this is the framework. Okay, directions for future research. I've sketched so far what I think of as the bare bones of an IU communication claim that has the chance of bridging the first-person, third-person divide. And now I want to look at some implications of this. And I want to begin with the question of what it is to know a person. Recall Reed's complaint. For all that that observation and inference delivers, what I call a father or brother or friend might only be a parcel of ideas in my mind. The challenge implicit in this complaint is to explain why and how our relations with people we know well, friends and family, contribute to our knowledge that we're not alone in the universe in a way that renders the idea that their existence is merely probable absurd. Okay? Interestingly, even some philosophers who provide an inferential account of our knowledge of other minds, such as Broad in his chapter devoted to other minds in his 1927 Mind and Its Place in Nature, and Russell in his famous chapter on analogy in his 1948 book Human Knowledge, claim that these emotionally laden relations with people make it the case that we're much more certain that other people exist than physical objects exist. Both say this. But Broad and Russell both say we must, Russell implicitly and Broad explicitly, and here I'm quoting Broad, stifle our emotions for the present and follow the argument whithersoever it may lead, which in both cases is an account of our knowledge of other minds based on inference, which yields a probability that these people who give me so much confidence that they exist in virtue of my relations with them, it's just a probability that they exist. Now, this is partly because of a general commitment to the nothing special claim and to the kind of story about how we gain knowledge in general that informs the first-person, third-person debate. But I think it's also, and perhaps mainly, because of a commitment to a very dominant view today, as ever, that all knowledge either consists in or is reducible to propositional knowledge, knowledge of facts, knowledge of truths. On such a view, emotionally laden relations with people we know have no independent weight when our interest and aim is to explain the nature of our knowledge of other minds. Now, the idea that knowing a person is reducible to knowledge of facts about them goes against the grain of the way we normally talk about what it is to know a person, against the grain of our normal understanding of it. So we don't say, for example, that people we've accumulated a lot of information about, many facts about that we've seen on TV, we don't normally say, oh, I know Trump, say. As we normally understand it, knowing a person requires at the very least some kind of personal encounter. But we can draw a distinction here. On one weaker notion of what it is to know a person, merely perceiving them suffices for saying I know them. So somebody asks you, do you know Joe Bloggs? And you say, oh yeah, I see him every day at the corner shop. Right. But we also have a stronger notion of what it is to know a person, a more demanding and I think more common notion. We sometimes describe it as, do you know the person? Do you know that person? Personally, as we say, personal knowledge. So these are two kinds of relational knowledge that on the face of it aren't reducible to propositional knowledge, one based on perceptual encounter, and one more demanding sense kind. Now this richer and more demanding one is often what we mean when we talk about what it is to know a person. And Lauer, in a 2014 paper entitled "What is it to know a person?" in the Conant and Riddle volume, calls this kind of knowledge, the more demanding one, knowledge by interaction, which in the account he develops, he calls it second-person knowledge. So here's a quote from his claim. To say that A knows B in this manner implies, in fact, it's the same thing as saying that B knows A. It is to say that A and B know each other. Okay. This is what constitutes knowledge by interaction as a sui generis kind of knowledge of persons. So the claim is we have, and we use it every day, a sense of what it is to know a person that entails mutual knowledge. We know each other. Otherwise, you don't say you know the person. Lauer himself doesn't say much about IU communication over time, but we can add that we have, when we have this kind of knowledge of persons, this is knowledge that's sustained by recurring IU communications of the kinds we've been describing. Knowledge comes in degrees. Sometimes it's weak, sometimes it gets stronger, sometimes you lose it, but it's a form of knowledge that's sustained by various forms of ongoing IU communication. Now there's a lot more to say and ask about that kind of knowledge, but suppose we agree that there is such a kind. A way we use the notion of what it is to know a person that involves this kind of mutuality. What more can we say about it? And here I think a very good place to start is a paper by David Hamlin, a 1974 paper called Person, Perception, Our Understanding of Others. And he argues that a proper account of the link between knowledge and understanding in the mental domain should take the question of what it is to know someone as its point of departure. And he makes two general suggestions here. The first is that our account of what it is to understand mental concepts should focus initially on the way they are used to express our knowledge and understanding of particular people. And the second is that by thus linking our understanding of mental concepts to the question of what it is to know a particular person, and he's thinking here developmentally in particular, the child's developing grasp of mental concepts. By thus linking these questions, we can begin to counter the view that our understanding of mental concepts can be captured by appeal to the kind of use that they might be put to in scientific explanations of behavior. For example, explanations that appeal to observation and inference. I turn to these general claims he makes in a moment, but he also makes three additional specific substantive claims that I think capture essential ingredients in paradigmatic cases of knowing a person. So the first is that the knowledge must be potentially reciprocal. We've covered that. The second is that it must involve some degree of emotional involvement with the other, or as he puts it sweetly, some degree of personal feelings. And third, that the relational emotions are potentially morally relevant. So let's bracket for his reciprocity claim, about which he doesn't say very much. The second two claims about our knowledge of persons say that our knowledge of persons is thick, inextricably bound up with emotions of potential moral significance. So one thing we can say is, if this is true about our knowledge of people, such knowledge is informed by a background episteme or understanding that's radically different from the detached, purely theoretical episteme or understanding that is appealed to when people say our knowledge of others is based on observation and inference. Rather, it's the kind of understanding that informs what Strawson in Freedom and Resentment in his 1962 paper called participatory attitude. So the distinction Strawson is interested in is between the objective attitude that we may have towards people. He was thinking of social scientists, but this would apply as much to scientific approaches to other people, on the one hand, and the kind of attitude we take to persons in virtue, and here I quote, of interpersonal human relationships with them. And as I'm going on quoting, our participatory attitudes are founded in such relations and include attitudes such as resentment, gratitude, forgiveness, anger, or the sort of love which two adults can ascribe or can sometimes be said to feel reciprocally for each other. And though he doesn't put it in these terms, we can read Hamlin as saying, it's these reactive attitudes rather than observation and inference that we should look to when explaining our primary grasp of mental concepts. Okay? And again, he's thinking developmentally. This is the framework in which the child acquires mental concepts. And I'll just say in brackets, this stands really opposed to, I think, a pretty dominant view in which children, babies, acquire their mental concepts by developing a capacity for inference to the best explanation, a form of scientific reasoning. Sometimes Bayesian inferences are appealed to. And I think it was Alison Gopnik who said we should treat little babies and young infants as little scientists about other people. They explain, they develop a theory about what's going on in them that explains their behavior. And we can contrast that with an account that appeals to the kind of communion and connecting that Tronick appeals to. Where he says, children acquire understanding in virtue of these communings, in the context rather of these communings and connecting. So there's two very different pictures. Okay. Now, these are two different pictures. Hamlin doesn't say very much about the reciprocity requirement, but suppose we fill it in the way I've suggested. The appeal to the idea of second-person knowledge. On the face of it, what we've got so far is the appeal in knowing people, in explanations of what it is to know a person, to ethically laden emotions, and the second person. And now a question arises whether there is a connection between them, whether there's a connection between the requirement of reciprocity and the claim that there's got to be some kind of emotionally charged, potentially moral ingredient when we think about what it is to know a person. But for the moment, and that's where I'm now switching to ethics and the connection between the second person and ethics. But for the moment, we can say that if we adopt and further develop Hamlin's ideas, our emotion-laden relational knowledge of people we know, far from being something to set aside or stifle as broad thought we should do, should be given center stage in any account of how we know that we're not, and go back to read, left alone as the only creature of God in the universe, in that forlorn state of egoism. So far from brushing them aside, this is a centerpiece that we should appeal to when explaining how we know that we're not alone, that our soul hasn't cheated us into thinking it has company. Okay, I now switch to ethics. So, much recent debate and the connection between ethics and the second person got going in response to a book by a 2009 book by Stephen Darwell called The Second Person Standpoint: Morality, Respect, and Accountability. In it, he claims that morality, I quote, rests on no more than a common competence to enter into second-personal relations of reciprocal address. The link between ethics and address he's interested in is, or the kind of address he's interested in when he claims that there is this kind of link, are those kinds of address that are expressive of what he calls a second-person standpoint, and here I quote, which is the perspective you and I take up when we make and acknowledge claims on one another's conduct and will. When I ask or demand that you get off my gouty toe, according to Darwell, I make a claim on your conduct which I present as authoritative, and which, in being acknowledged as such by you, gives you a second-person reason to act. Now, it's faced a lot of criticism, rightly, in my view. One thing I'll mention is this. This is an objection, an obvious objection, is that surely it's wrong for you to step on my gouty toe, whether I ask you to or not, or demand it or not. So Darwell, in responding to that criticism, said, oh, what I mean is, I'm appealing to a Kantian ideal community. Those are the demands I'm responding to. Well, if those are the demands, that's what justifies the authority, then you're giving up on the second person. You're giving up on the relation here. It's another version of what makes it wrong or right. Wrong to step on your toe is some version of what the ideal community would dictate is wrong. But I think the main issue here is this, or what's going wrong here, is again captured by Doug Lavin in his 2014 paper, where he suggested what goes wrong in Darwell's account is due to an absence of any discussion of what it is to be aware of someone of you, what it is, as he puts it, to think under a second-person mode of presentation, and in particular, the absence of a link with debates in the philosophy of mind about what role the second person plays in providing us with knowledge that others exist. And what we need, he says, if the flavor or the intuition that there's some link between the second person and ethics is to carry sway, is what we need is precisely a way of showing how and why our claims to know someone based on the second person are intrinsically linked to an ethical concern for them. We need a link between knowledge and ethics. So we need to show how the second person is essential simultaneously for yielding knowledge of people and introducing a moral dimension to this knowledge. And I think he's exactly right. And I should say that I think it's symptomatic of the way ethics is done, that it's done in complete divorce from questions in the philosophy of mind. I should say that the same holds for the way people do philosophy of mind. It's done in divorce. Tends to be done in divorce from question of ethics. And one interesting aspect of bringing, one promising aspect of bringing the second person to center stage is that it forces a kind of connection between ethics and mind. Questions about knowledge and questions about ethics. I should say that anyway, if you look at Buber, the link with the ethics is there already. For example, I seem to have lost a page, but I will find it, and if not, I will ad lib. If we look to Buber, the link with ethics is there already. So I've spoken so far of attitudes of address as expressing a readiness to communicate further. As Buber himself thinks of address, to adopt this attitude is to adopt an attitude or two of confirmation towards the person. Affirmation. And this concept of confirmation has some resemblance to Cavell's notion of acknowledgement. And it's in a kind of continuum with appeals to recognition that stem mainly from Hegel. To appeals to the requirement of mutual recognition and respect for the other's autonomy. So these are all ways that people have done, have appealed to in filling out what it is to address someone. It's to recognize, it's to affirm, it's to acknowledge. This is how people have filled in the notion of address. So if we treat IU thinking in this way, ethics is built into the reciprocity requirement in what it is to know a person. And it's built into, if we take the mutual interdependence claim on board, into the account we give of self-consciousness and its relation to our knowledge of others. So ethics comes into the very core of these concepts that are treated independently of ethics. So I'll just make a few comments on that. I think there are terrific issues to be pursued here, but just some care is needed. So first of all, there's a distinction in kind, or rather an emphasis between, on the one hand, appeals to recognition and grasp of the concept of a person when applied to fully self-conscious speech acts, and on the other, what Buber and others have meant by confirmation. The concepts that are often appealed to in filling out the latter are those of emotional openness, connection, compassion, care, and so forth. Concepts that are appealed to in spelling out recognition are those of rights, demands, claims, the full-blown concept of a person. The distinction between these two families of concepts is sometimes discussed under the heading of the relation between the ethics of care and of justice. Whatever one, I'm not going into that debate now. My own view is that we need both families of concepts in spelling out the role of the second person. And I think it's an extremely interesting project to try and tease these out, and how some come into some aspects of treating another as you and others into other aspects, in particular those involved in verbal communication. And just a tiny point on this, it would be absurd to claim that every time I chat with someone about the bus stop, about, say, how buses always come in threes, and never when you want them, I'm manifesting deep concern for them. So in the case of care, I think what we have to say and try and give an account of is how the capacity, the potential for care is built into the very notion of address. It's there to be tapped the more we know someone or if something happens. It's not an addendum, but it doesn't have to be actively manifested in every exchange. With respect to recognition, of course, we know about communications that abuse people, that do anything but recognize their rights and their autonomy and so forth. So here too, with respect to that aspect of IU communication, there's work to be done in showing how that's, as it were, a deviation from the norm that we expect, something to that effect. So there's a lot of, I think, interesting work, both about the relation between care and recognition, and how exactly we tune it such that it makes sense to build it into the very notion of address without ignoring hard cases or being ridiculous. Now I have a question about whether I have time to get on to my third topic. Not really.
You could say a few words.
Okay, I won't go there. I'll just tell you why I think it's interesting. How many, what do I have, 3 minutes? 3 minutes, okay. Here goes. When people talk about the sociality or the sense in which we're essentially social beings, they mean one of two things, or both, but the discussion falls into two kinds of groups. So there's those that talk mainly about the sense in which we're essentially immersed in cultures, history, conventions, and so forth. This is something that the psychologist Michael Tomasello calls the collective intentionality thesis. And one role that's often given to this kind of immersion is that it's in virtue of this kind of immersion that we follow rules, that we have norms, and this kind of norm is necessary for the very possibility of objective thought, for distinguishing between getting it right and getting it wrong. The other way of talking about the sense in which we're essentially social will appeal not to immersion in cultures and so forth, but to the kind of thing we've been talking about, IU communication, one-to-one, face-to-face communication. There's lots of versions. Tomasello calls this the joint intentionality thesis, and there's lots of virtues of it. Now, discussions of each tend to proceed completely independently of each other. In my view, and I'm cutting this very short, 1 more minute, I think one of the most interesting challenges for the kind of story I've been telling here about IU communication, which gives a very different sense in which we're essentially social. We're essentially social in that we're connected to particular people through conversations. There's no reference here to norms or anything. I think the really interesting challenge for IU communication, to make it as fundamental as I think it is to show why it's required for entering into and manifesting the kind of grip on the seems right is right distinction that's required for objective thought. And I think that the way to go here is to appeal to the phenomenon of joint attention, which occurred in our university meeting. Me and my colleague both had a third object there. We shared an experience of it based on the communicative relation. There's a lot of work in developmental psychology that thinks that these triangles are the basis for the capacity to think objective thoughts at all, as opposed to the dyadic interactions. So what I think is a hugely interesting topic, and a very difficult one actually, which has proved very difficult. How do we get the kind of sharing and mutuality right here? A very interesting topic is to show why that kind of sharing and how is the basis for the capacity to have a grip on the idea of a world out there that's independent of our making.
So there's a analogy here, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in your thinking about the second person as bridging the third person divide, with philosophical externalism in general. Now, you may disagree, but I think, for my money, the idea that the content of thought is essentially relational, or essentially builds in outer objects, isn't a cure for philosophical skepticism. It just tells us that sometimes, even though we can't tell when, we will be in contact with outer objects. So I'm surprised that, given the analogy between that and your thinking about other minds, you see your version of I-thou thinking as a cure for the isolation claim.
Sure. Not a small question. So there's two kinds of externalism. There's one that is bifurcationary, right? It says, what makes it the case that I'm having a thought about an object, say a demonstrative thought about an object? I can give you an independent story about how things seem to me in my mind, and then I'll be having a demonstrative thought when in fact I'm standing in a causal relation, where my mind, individuated in this way, stands in a causal relation. So so first of all, and the alternative non-bifurcationary approach says that object out there that I perceive is internal to how things are to me, from my perspective. And here I might appeal, for example, to the relation of acquaintance. Okay. So there's first of all a difference in how it's described. The account I gave of you thoughts is analogously non-bifurcationary. The other is internal to how things are delineated for me. From my perspective, there's that kind of world dependence of my perspective, except that it's not just the existence of the other, but the other's take on me that comes into delineating it. So that's the first thing. And now there's a question of what kind of answer is that kind of non-bifurcationary story about experience or thought about another. What kind of answer is that to skepticism? And I think there's familiar moves you might make here about saying that the skepticism gets going only if you insist first on excluding the world and excluding others from how things are to you, for you from your perspective. So that's roughly the dialectic. It's exactly analogous to claims about demonstrative thought and experience, whether the external objects is internal to how things are for me. And then rejection of the idea that I have to first, then the claim would be, and skepticism requires that I first take it out of my mind and then. So anyway, does that address your question at all?
It does address it, yes, it does address it.
Whether it satisfies you is another question.
Plenty more to say about that, but I'm going to ask you another one now. You talked about knowing a person must involve some degree of emotional involvement with the other. So there's a quote from Simone Weil, which I'm going to misremember, but it's something like, the specialness of the human presence, passing a stranger on the pavement, is unlike passing any other thing, because we have this kind of effect on one another, instant recognition of another person's humanity. And that experience of the specialness of the presence of the other can happen without catching the person's eye. You see them, they need not see you. Where's the emotional involvement? I mean, mightn't the emotional involvement reduce to awareness that what you're in the presence of is another human being?
Now that's really interesting. I don't know if in that kind of case you'd say you knew the person. right? So certainly there's various forms of awareness of the existence of others in passing that have great significance, but this was specifically a claim about what it is to know a person.
I see.
And the claim was that, and this was Hamlet's claim, and I think he's right, that when, about our ordinary use of the notion of knowing a person, that there's some, as he puts it, personal feelings germane to that. I mean, we think otherwise that this is when people talk about psychopathy, they mean precisely when they describe interactions that are lacking feelings from the psychopath's side. Yeah, anyway, but it was a question specifically about, a claim specifically about what it is to know someone.
To know a person,
yeah.
Yes, okay. Last question. This is about ethics. How much exactly does the capacity to enter into reciprocal I-thou relations buy you ethically? I mean, somebody might say it buys you moral goodness. Somebody else down the other end of the spectrum might say it just buys you entrance to the space of ethical evaluation without any guarantee of how well or badly you handle it once you're in there. Where do you stand on that spectrum?
The latter.
Ah.
And I think that's all that's required. If I've understood your question. So that's the very end when I said we have to build in the potential for care.
Okay.
And have to introduce recognition in a way that makes it okay to posit that as the ideal, and the cases where it's absent, when there is abuse and so forth, as a deviation. So not as an ideal, as the norm from which you deviate when you're not doing it. But the other thing I'd say to that, and I think this is right, this is something that Moran brings out in his exchange of word when he quotes Aristotle and Feinberg, simply engaging in, we're political animals and speaking, okay? We're in the business. They apply to us, these norms, from the word go, so long as we're social beings. So it's not something that has to be thrust on us. We've got the whole world going and all our minds going, and then where are the norms, right? So does that address your question?
But there's no guarantee of norm compliance.
No, absolutely not. Oh, God, that would be stupid, yeah.
Well,
given the ways of the world.
People have made much stronger claims.
That's true, yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
So I didn't mean the question was stupid, I meant it would be stupid of me to say so, right? Just so it's clear,
you could say the question
right?
was stupid if you want.
No, but I didn't mean it. It's not what I meant.
Over to you, your questions. There's a roving mic for those of you who'd like to ask something. So. Yeah, come to the front.
Thank you so much. There we go. Thank you so much for your talk, Naomi. So at some point in the middle, when you were talking and when you moved on to specifically talking about knowing, that made me think of what I think is the way it's used in the Crucible, when to know is an intimacy, it has intimacy and usually sexuality, but particularly intimacy there. And then that kind of got me thinking about the concept of intimacy and whether that is either just another way of describing some of the things you're talking about, or a different conceptual room that you could go into that's kind of parallel, or just if there's any, where that set of ideas comes into play.
That's terrific. I think the concept of intimacy is an extremely interesting one. And it would certainly be one of the concepts that you'd certainly want to bring into when we talk about knowing someone well. Because the thing about the sort of very simple notion of knowing a person that I introduced is it comes in degrees. right? And also, so we know some people you know a bit, others you don't know, so you know better, and also you get to know a person better. And then we can start talking about the kinds of communications and sharings that go into this better knowing, and the kinds that go into intimacy, which is probably the closest kind of knowing that you can get. And I just think it's a really interesting question. What have you written about this?
No.
No, right. What it is to be intimate with someone. But I think that it's partly a matter of time, isn't it?
I suppose the part of it that interests me particularly is the non-sexual intimacy.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the
actually,
feeling
that's what I have in
that's
mind.
something
Yeah.
that we,
What?
the feeling that that's something which we could all benefit from, and that connection with the stranger on the street, or particularly maybe the stranger sitting next to you on the train, where it's a fleeting encounter, and you can't really say you know them in the longitudinal sense, but something was shared that was so potent.
Well, I think that's also, so I wouldn't say I was intimate, but there's something very lovely, I think, about these moments of quick exchanges with a stranger, of sharing a joke. Or there's someone a few days ago that we were both looking at a beautifully frosted tree, and we just shared an appreciative and walked on. And so those aren't cases of knowing, those are cases of communication, but I think I agree that they're very valuable and we value them very much. But was your thought that there's a kind of intimacy in it? That's interesting. What, just in virtue of the sharing? I was thinking of intimacy as more something that comes with time and knowing of habits and revealing secrets, but maybe you're right, that moment, that flash, there's a kind of connection that's intimate, a kind of sharing, almost of a secret. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, I can see a couple, so let's go over to that side of the room first, and then over there.
This question, thank you for a really, really interesting talk. This question may be based on the fact that I don't really know what knowing means in philosophical terms, but does knowing something indicate that it's true? And if so, I wonder how that relates in the second person. To know somebody indicates, to my layperson's mind at least, that you know them and that you're right in what you think about them. Whereas actually we know through communication with others that quite often we think we know someone and in fact we don't. And I wonder how that relates maybe to the intimacy point, because one thing that happens in an IU relation is that you get feedback on what you think of as your knowledge. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether that process of the way that the process of communication can contribute to a kind it's the reciprocality point, right? But you can actually get confirmation through conversation about whether or not your knowledge is in fact true. And perhaps you could help me understand that a bit better.
Yeah. Well, there's one question. So I was drawing a distinction between a relational sense of knowledge and knowing facts, and which incidentally a lot of philosophers wouldn't accept. It all boils down to facts in the end. But knowledge, you raised the question of, am I right in thinking that I know someone, for example? And I think many of us have had experiences where somebody does something and you think, I didn't know them very well at all, it turns out. Where did that come from? Normally when you say it, it's for worse, but it could be for better. So it's true that, and when I was insisting on the relational knowledge, it wasn't, once we've got that, of course we accumulate a lot of views about the person. And some of them will be cases of knowledge. but some might be mistaken as cases of knowledge. I thought I knew that he was generous, right? And so certainly a lot of what's, and so I talked mainly about the IU connection, but there's knowledge that you share about each other. But then there's mistakes you make. You think it's shared knowledge and it's not. And I guess I was taking it for granted that to say that you know a person does involve getting quite a bit right. So you stand in this relation, you can have all these emotions. Because I said very little about the knowledge what thing and the sharing of knowledge, but you wouldn't say you know someone if you got it all wrong, right? So no, I think that's a really interesting.
I can tell you if you've got it right, and that's what's special about the relation.
Well, exactly. I mean, you can correct it and so forth, but if you go on, and that's what we think of, that comes in, you share knowledge, right? But you can be wrong about whether it is shared knowledge because you're wrong about whether it's knowledge. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's an aspect of the knowing that I didn't talk about.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very, very insightful. I've never heard anything on this topic before, so I'm kind of new to all of it. So my question was specifically about that sharing of knowledge, just in your kind of opinion, specifically back to just the first quote on the page that caught my eye was that if somebody is feeling pain and I perceive that, is it I who am feeling pain or is it them type thing? So when we're in this conversation and we're sharing this, emotional feedback back and forth, do you think the percentage matters? And what I mean by that is like, if I am feeling it more than that other person, so if to put it in like percentage ways, say like they're giving me like 20% vibes, but I'm picking it up like very strongly, do you think that affects that sharing of knowledge and that perception of the you versus I, versus if they're like sending out really strong emotional signals, but maybe I don't pick it up super strongly, does that affect how much I perceive their you? Does that make sense?
Okay, so maybe it's again a related question, how much? So I'm communicating with you, and in some way you're attempting to share knowledge.
And do you think like how much that person is giving matters or changes the perception?
How much the
person is like kind of emotionally communicating to you? So versus if they were to tell you, oh, I'm sad, versus if you were to see them across the room maybe crying or something. Those are two different perceptions.
There's a lot. So yeah, no, these are all great questions of, which as I said, I didn't say anything about what exactly goes into what I call the knowledge what, the knowledge of what you're feeling, say. How much is dependent on me picking up the right thing, on you projecting it in the right way. I just took a very thin knowledge, a very thin, I had in mind a very thin claim is that when we get it right, we share the knowledge. In contrast to a case where when I'm watching you, the knowledge isn't shared, okay? When I pick up knowledge by looking at you, it's something I'm doing on my own. Contrasted with the cases in communication, it's something we're doing together. What's required for it to be a case of real knowledge, shared knowledge, is a really difficult and interesting one, I think. And I think, is that roughly the question you're raising?
Yeah, like what kind of constitutes that sharing of knowledge?
Yeah, no, I think those are great questions to think about. And it also connects back with the intimacy question about how much give there is, as it were. How much am I letting you know? How much is the other am I willing to pick up from what you're letting me know, and so forth. Yeah. I think, is that roughly it? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, those are great questions to do more work on, to think about.
Go ahead.
I had a question because you brought up the Hegelian recognition.
Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
The Hegelian recognition that
Yeah.
you brought up while talking about the ethics of care. And it made me think of, I think the section that you're referring to is about how self-consciousness only finds a satisfaction in another self-consciousness. And then we get the lordship and bondage chapter that like goes into why you should treat the other person not like they're your bondsman, but you need to grant them some recognition to find your own satisfaction as well. And I was thinking about receptions of Hegel more than Hegel himself, because Simone de Beauvoir and like Frantz Fanon both write about that chapter specifically, and about Hegelian recognition when talking about both justice and I guess the ethics of care would be built into that, because they're both talking about race and gender and recognition in relation to those things. So I was wondering if maybe if we're taking that kind of framework into consideration and thinking about the IU relationship in that way, where it's kind of, if your own self-understanding kind of depends on this other person granting you recognition and you recognizing them as well, then just because you've entered this social situation, it seems to be the case that the ethics are just kind of built into it. And maybe that's why it lends itself really well to say what like Fanon is talking about or Beauvoir is talking about, and that's why they like picked up on that concept of recognition. That's just what I was thinking, that maybe it's already built in.
No, that's great, and exactly. And I think quite a lot of work now is happening under the second person label, appealing to that notion of recognition. I think that care is different. Compassion. There's a bunch of concepts. So I think of the recognition as essentially a political notion. It's us, qua political animals, makers of demands, speakers of justice. And I think that there's something that Buber does bring out, which isn't there in that discourse. But I think the you, so you can think of IU communication or the you as a kind of hinge. But in virtue of being a speaker and so forth, you get all the recognition stuff and the political animal stuff. But you also get built in the potential for care. For example, when you think about what it is to know a person and the role of the second person in providing for progressively knowing someone. And I do think that care and compassion here do have a separate life to play, and especially in the knowledge question rather than in the politics, the discourse question, the speaking question, the communication thing. Does that address what you're saying?
I think so. I guess I'm wondering if care and justice would just come or follow naturally from a situation where I recognize that you have autonomy and rights and personhood on your own, and that you're capable of resisting me. But I guess maybe that's a bit optimistic to think that, you know, if you recognize me as such, that you will care for me.
Yeah, there's different understanding. I think so I'm connecting it. The philosopher Avishai Margalit distinguishes between morality and ethics. And so morality is what we owe anyone qua human being. And that, you can think, is very much connected to the concept of recognition. Anyone. Whereas ethics links to the kind of relations we have with people we know. And especially the key concept there is care. And we don't owe care to everyone, right? Maybe, though I know that some people who appeal to ethics of care think we do. But his claim is, no, we owe everybody recognition and justice and fairness and so forth. The care goes into people we know and people who we're responsible for. And so sure, it could be that it all falls out. There's some notion of recognition where you can get them both, but I actually see value, at least initially, in distinguishing them and seeing where the different concepts take us and the different kinds of relations that they come into. But all of them are doing what I want them all to do, is to be built into, and this is something that I don't know if you get from the Hegelian story, of questions about what it is to know that other people exist, to the question of other minds. And I think this is what you does. It brings all of that and links it to questions of knowledge of existence. And I'm not sure that you get that in the recognition literature, at least that I'm familiar with. Thank you.
Well, I don't see any more hands going up, and maybe that's just as well because it's time, and I have tried to build a reputation for strictness about calling things. So apologies to those of you who might have some esprit d'escalier and think of a great question just as you're on your way down the stairs. But there will be many more sessions in which you can ask questions. Thank you in the meantime for coming and for your participation. Let's thank Naomi once again.